The applause made my blood run cold. It wasn't the polite clap you give at the end of a speech. It was a slow, satisfied sound, measured, almost ceremonial, coming from the woman who should have reached for a napkin and asked if her daughter-in-law was all right. Instead, Helen Harrison clapped her hands together like someone savoring a lesson well taught. Around our table, the roast steam hung in the air. Forks paused halfway to mouths. My daughter sat with her face turned away, one hand pressed to her cheek no, not where I wanted to look. My name is Elena Vance. I'm 57, a family law attorney by trade and a mother by everything else. For 35 years, I have listened to confessions, drafted parenting plans, and cross-examined men who thought power could be confused with right. I thought the courtroom had taught me most of what I needed to know about human cruelty. I was wrong in the simplest way. Nothing prepares you for violence when it arrives at your own kitchen table. That afternoon, March 20th, began like any other Sunday in our house. We observed a small ritual for Robert, my husband, who had died 5 years earlier. A roast chicken, a slice of his favorite lemon cake, and stories that always landed on his laugh. Robert used to sit at the head of the table and make a joke about how the gravy always conspired against him. We honored him by keeping his seat warm, if only for an hour, by telling the same old stories until the punchline softened. Those Sundays were the bones of our family. They were discipline and sanctuary all at once. Ariana, my daughter, carried that warmth with her. Bright, exact, the kind of mind that loves numbers and molecules. A chemical engineer who could explain refrigeration with the same affection I had for precedent and procedure. Ariana met Mark Harrison 3 years before that night. To anyone else, he was magnetic. Polite introductions, a steady job, the kind of man who smiled easily around parents. At first, I liked him. He was attentive to small things, remembering a detail from a story, offering to wash up after dinner, a quiet deference that, as a lawyer, I recognized as an early effort at goodwill. But as the months went by, the little things stopped feeling like kindness. They began to feel like measurement. Who arrived late, which shirt was acceptable, when a call was too many. I watched my daughter trade the lightness in her eyes for a carefulness that looked, in the end, like armor. I tell you this because abuse rarely announces itself with a red flag and a marching band. It arrives in degrees. Control looks like concern at first. Sarcasm becomes correction. Jokes become footnotes of humiliation. And isolation wears the face of protection. I knew the signs in the abstract. Years of cases where I sat across from women and asked the questions no one else seemed to want to ask. But the truth is, your knowledge of abuse as a professional doesn't inoculate your heart when it is your child who shrinks. There were arguments, small, sharp things, and there were apologies that arrived like weather, sudden and temporary. Ariana minimized, as many survivors do. It was nothing, she'd say. Once, in private, she admitted that Mark had raised his voice in front of colleagues at a dinner. Another time, he blocked her from seeing a former friend because you need to focus. She laughed it off when neighbors asked. She did what I wanted her to do. She rationalized and protected him. She did not yet see the through line that would stitch those moments into a pattern. Helen, his mother, contributed in ways that looked innocent at a glance. She offered to help with renovations. She gave Ariana recipes and, in public, flattered her with the kind of words women use when they wish to be inside a family. But Helen had an edge. Her compliments often arrived with a corrective clause. "You're so talented, of course you'd want to stay at home more." And when I pressed, she directed attention away from Ariana's complaints with a moralizing laugh. The lines blurred. Care folded into control, support braided with instruction. I wasn't blind. I grieved my own illusions quietly. But grief complicates clarity. Robert's absence made us hold fast to the rituals more than we might have otherwise. I could see that Ariana's circle tightened. I watched her drop small joys and make practical concessions. Jobs declined, dinners rearranged. Still, she was a grown woman, and I am not a mother who believes in stepping between every crosswind. I offered counsel, I offered my home. She accepted sometimes and declined other times. Mothers and adult children navigate those borders with a mixture of love and respect, missteps and thresholds. We parted, sometimes in argument, sometimes in laughter, as families do. Our house on the corner smelled like lemon and rosemary that Sunday. The roast was just beginning to crisp when Mark arrived. He took off his jacket without a word and sat at the place I had set for him, and for the first few minutes he behaved like every guest should, polite, attentive. Conversation flowed about work, Ariana's projects at the plant, my small practice, the garden Robert had loved. We held to that familiar orbit, food, modest jokes, the kind of banalities that shelter a family from the weather. Then, out of nowhere, the conversation spun. I remember the fork hitting the porcelain, a small sound. Then the world narrowed to the movement of Mark's hand. It happened in a motion that was too quick to be furious and too deliberate to be accidental. 3 slaps. Not 1, not 2, 3. The rhythm itself felt punishing, a staccato punctuation that held a lesson. The sound was muffled by dinnerware and the hum of the refrigerator, but the space it created was absolute. Everyone inhaled at once. Ariana's face went blank, and then she turned toward me with eyes that did not belong to the woman I'd raised. Helen applauded, slowly, like someone closing a book after a satisfying chapter. Her hands came together as if she were applauding a virtuoso. Instead, she was applauding the violence against her daughter-in-law. The table became a small island of frozen terror and confusion. A spoon trembled at my elbow. Porcelain rattled against the plate. For a second time that day, I tasted lemon and metallic grief. When my blood ran cold, it was not only at the slap. It was at the meaning of that applause. The social alchemy that turned assault into pedagogy, that reshaped humiliation into instruction. It reframed the wound as correction, and in that reframing there was an old, dangerous entitlement, power sanctified by kinship. In Helen's face, I saw the architecture of generations. A woman who had taught her son that the world bends to influence, that families are instruments for controlling narratives, not sanctuaries for safety. I had to act. The decision did not erupt from a public lawyer's desire to hold a man accountable on principle alone. It rose from a mother's bones, older than every case file on my shelf. There is a sound mothers know, the tiny, urgent animal noise our body makes when one of our young is hurt. The centuries of instinct and the 1,000 hours of legal training merged then into a single precise motion. I cleared my throat. My voice was calm on purpose. Calm is often more disarming than alarm. I set my phone on the table and put it on speaker. I could feel Ariana's hand tightening at the edge of the table. Her jaw worked like someone trying to hold back the tide of something she had kept down for years. I called Commander Miller. Commander Miller had been a friend of Robert's. He was not only a police commander, he was also the man who had once come over to fix the light on our porch when Robert's arthritic hands couldn't manage the ladder. I called him because I knew he would listen first and act second. When I spoke, I used plain language and designed the record as I would draft a pleading. Clear facts, time, place, actors. I did not ask for justice. I asked for documentation, for response, for immediate protection for my daughter. On speaker, there was no melodrama, only my description. The date, the location, the fact of the assault, the applause, the name of the person who had struck Ariana. I described Helen's reaction. I said plainly that I could hear the applause in the background. I asked the commander to send an officer and to document the call. I gave him our address and the names of everyone at the table. I kept my voice steady the way I keep it across a cross-examination, deliberate. Maybe it was the attorney in me that thought to create contemporaneous evidence. Maybe it was the mother who knew that if nothing else, a phone record would be a footnote against later gaslighting. Ariana's hands only trembled once. The room contracted around the phone speaker like a theater waiting for a curtain to drop. I told the commander in that flat, necessary way that I wanted this recorded. I wanted officers to be sent to our home immediately. I did not make a speech about punishment. I made a demand for safety. We are in no danger of escalation, I said aloud as a fact we all knew to be untrue. We are in immediate risk of further violence from the man who struck my daughter and the family members who condone it. You could call it performative. You could say a lawyer's instincts turned a mother's panic into protocol. Either way, it mattered, because a call is not only a plea. In this country, it becomes a trace, a time-stamped assertion that something happened. In that cold digital trace, we placed our best hope, the chance that the world would see what we saw. The response was not cinematic. There was no instantaneous rush of sirens and swarming cars like a movie. But within an hour, 2 uniforms arrived with the sort of professional gravity that belongs to people who have seen the underside of families more times than they like. They listened. They took statements. They arrested Mark. It happened with the kind of bureaucratic deliberateness that leaves no room for theater. He was handcuffed, read his rights, and led away. No shouting, no supplication, just the weight of restraint and the click of cuff hinges. Ariana watched him go with a hollowing that looked to me like both relief and a new kind of fear. The officer took down Helen's name as a witness. I watched Helen's face for a trace of conscience. Nothing. She smoothed her skirt with the indifference of a woman who'd never had to face consequences that would strip her of her comforts. The night closed on an odd, small justice, the arrest. We obtained an emergency protective order that evening, an order that, in paper at least, put distance between Mark and Ariana. It was, for the moment, a victory. And yet the taste in my mouth was complicated. Arrest is a narrow victory. It is the beginning of a path, not its end. I had seen this dynamic before. A household moment made visible, snapped into a criminal docket, and then swallowed by a larger system that is skilled at erasing. There are families who will rally to the accused. There are networks of power who will twist the narrative. That thought, familiar to me as legal counsel, blew across the edges of my relief like a cold wind. We had won a skirmish. We had not yet won the war. That night, after the officers left and the house settled into a kind of shocked silence, Ariana sat on the back steps with a cup of tea gone cold. We spoke slowly, with the hesitance of survivors untangling themselves from years of normalized harm. I kept thinking it would stop, she said. If I did better, if I said the right thing at work, if I was less busy, he would relax. He said he loved me, Mom. He said it was for us. The easiest lie to believe is the one that contains a compliment. I did what mothers do. I held her and I listened. I did what a lawyer does next. I documented everything I could remember about the night and the patterns that led to it. I stayed awake long into the early hours, drafting notes like a litigator preparing an affidavit. Dates, prior incidents, who said what, who was present. Memory can be a slippery thing. Contemporaneous notation anchors it. I ensured statements were sworn, that the evidence collected that night was cataloged and preserved. That was neither legal advice given to you nor a how-to guide. It was simply what happened in our house because it needed to happen for Ariana's protection and for truth to have a chance. The arrest made people talk. Within hours, a few of Ariana's coworkers called. Some offered help. A neighbor dropped off a casserole. Old friends sent lukewarm texts. But not everyone rallied in the way I expected. Social instincts are strange. The community that applauds you for adopting a dog will sometimes recoil at the sight of scandal. Friends measure risk, acquaintances calculate association. In one of the small cruelties of the modern world, support is sometimes a commodity that must be budgeted. Even as I took comfort in the immediate physical separation, I knew the shape of the next battle stretch. It would not be only in courtrooms. It would be in the spaces where narrative is currency, newspapers, online forums, and whispered reputations. It would be in the places where people with connections feel comfortable using those connections to rearrange facts to their liking. When Mark was booked, the intake photograph felt like a proof plate, his face flattened by fluorescent light, his eyes averting the camera. I saw a man who was small in the particular shame of being visible. But I also saw someone whose family had resources, whose mother moved through social registers with ease. That combination, privilege plus denial, would prove dangerous in the days to come. For now, though, we had a moment where the law and a mother's instinct had intersected to stop the immediate threat. Commander Miller stayed in touch with us for the first 48 hours. He was the kind of man who understood that arrests are sometimes the only way to create breathing room for a survivor. He offered practical things, names of victim advocates, instructions that were simple and humane, not legal templates. He reminded me in a way that felt more human than professional to be careful with assumptions about what would follow. There's more than one way the powerful can fight back, he said, not as threat, but as history. We spent those days tending to Ariana's wounds that could not be stitched by doctors. Shame, second-guessing, the old habit of assuming the worst about oneself. There were physical checks, an ER visit that recorded an abrasion, and a medical note that would later sit under an evidentiary label, and there were private conversations that felt like excavations. She told me, finally, that it had not been the first time something like this had happened. She spoke softly of other nights, hands that lingered too long on the small of her back, a shove pushed under the umbrella of "we were playing." Each of those moments carried the grain of a pattern I had seen 1,000 times as counsel. Escalation, normalization, the final punctuation at our table. I remember thinking about Robert that week, how he would have recognized this for what it was without needing a file. He had an old moral clarity. He would have taken a chair and simply said, "No." My memory of him became more than sentiment. It became a model for ordinary courage. As a mother, I feared that his absence left us thin on muscle. As a lawyer, I recognized the work ahead, the case file, the interviews, the witness preparation. As a daughter of a husband I missed, I wanted to sit and never move. But life presses on. Cases must be narrated into structure for law to understand them. Histories of violence must be translated into statements, dates, marks, and witness lists. The moment of the slap became, in my hands, an initial pleading, a narrative that could be read in a courtroom and understood. I am not suggesting that paperwork is the same as healing. Far from it. But in our system, facts on a page are often what tip an inquiry into action. In those first days, the initial legal team, local prosecutors who understood family violence, met with us. They listened to the audio of my call to Commander Miller. They looked at medical notes. They took statements from neighbors who had heard the commotion. They were careful, as prosecutors must be, about what could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. I trusted their caution. Prosecutors do not win cases on emotion. They win them on evidence, pattern, and the credibility of statements. We had the call, we had witness testimony, and we had Ariana's own account. Still, I could feel the machine begin to turn in a deeper way. A different kind of pressure was gathering, one that had nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with reputation. Power, once threatened, reaches for the tools it knows. Narrative control, contacts and institutions, the ability to command attention and redirect suspicion. I had seen this in courtrooms and boardrooms. The shadow it casts can be long and intentional. That shadow moved faster than I expected. Within a week, a low-grade campaign of insinuation began to circulate. Not yet in the papers, not yet in the halls of justice, but in social streams and behind closed doors. Claims that Ariana was unstable, that she had overreacted, that the story was more complicated than a single queasy phone recording suggested. Some of it was personal, some of it felt orchestrated. We could not, in the early days, prove coordination. We could feel the edges of it like draft through a door. I will not pretend I felt unthreatened. Power has subtle ways of wearing down resolve. There are reputations bought and sold for the price of silence. There are careers quietly endangered by being associated with scandal. Within the week, someone mentioned that Helen had friends in the right places, people who could make small administrative problems bloom into crises. That might have sounded paranoid if it had not lined up with the history we had seen before. Families who tamped down accountability with influence and money. What kept me steady in that interval between the arrest and the expected counterpunch was a stubborn combination of love and training. I had read too many cases where the person with the loudest connections rewrote a story into doubt. I had also watched mothers break open systems with consistent pressure and the refusal to accept a sanitized version of what had happened. In my practice, I'd seen how persistent documentation and thoughtful advocacy could create openings. In my home life, I knew that persistence could save a person from sinking into the silence of shame. We did small things that felt both trivial and monumental. We changed locks. We installed cameras at our own door, not because we wanted to weaponize our grief, but because the need for a record had become clear. We spoke with Ariana's employer to secure her position. We told just enough to protect, but not so much that it would be misheard. I sat with clinicians who helped Ariana name things she had until then kept in the dark. For a mother who was also a lawyer, those were some of the oddest hours. Counseling, advocacy, strategy, roles shifting like pieces on a board. And then came the first sign that this would not simply be a private legal matter. An anonymous email, no return address, landed in my inbox with a thinly veiled threat about reputations and consequences. It contained nothing material, just an insinuation that if I pursued the matter, costs would follow. I saved it. I did not answer. Threats, like applause, are attempts to teach. People use them to enforce a code of silence. By the end of that first week, we had taken the initial actions the system permits: arrest, protective order, documentation, support services. Ariana slept in my guest room for a few nights. We took turns standing watch like old soldiers. We moved the lemon cake to a higher shelf because the small rituals of Robert's memory felt both tender and too visible in the steadiness of our new, fragile safety. Even in the shelter of those small precautions, I understood this for what it was, the opening salvo. If the moment at our table had revealed anything, it was the deeper structure of control Helen represented. A mother applauding violence is not a passive observer. She is a participant in the logic that justifies it. That logic does not always rest on brute force. Often it rests on relationships, favors, and a willingness to rewrite events so that the family name remains unblemished. My work from then on would be as much about truth-telling as it would be about lawyering. It would be about insisting that our story be allowed to stand, unedited, in the places that decide consequence. And so I readied for what would come next: depositions, video reviews, potential countersuits. I scheduled interviews. I gathered witnesses. I arranged for Ariana to speak on her terms with survivors who could help her map the path forward. We made plans that were practical and humane. We did what families do. We held each other and we prepared. I did not know then that the first public strike, Mark's arrest, would be the easiest thing we'd accomplish. I did not yet understand the way influence could turn institutions into battlegrounds, nor did I know how far Helen would go to keep the narrative she preferred. I only knew that the next move required patience and strategy and the kind of stubbornness that comes from loving without calculation. The kitchen light dimmed that night, and the lemon scent lingered. I sat at the table, my hands wrapped around a mug gone cold, thinking of the applause and the precise, awful lesson it was meant to convey. My daughter slept upstairs. I thought about how long it had taken us to get to that moment, years of small things stacked like bricks. I thought about how long it might take to undo them. The one call I made had set a sequence in motion. The legal steps were clear on paper. The moral work was unbounded. We were, at that point, only at the beginning of an involuted process where truth could be made visible or invisible by force of narrative and money. I had evidence, but evidence must be presented. I had the law, but the law is imperfect and subject to influence. I had a daughter whose trust and sense of self had been injured. And I had, oddly, a growing conviction that truth, when pursued carefully and relentlessly, has a way of revealing the architecture beneath the applause. The days after the arrest were a study in small certainties and widening doubts. We slept poorly, we triaged, we cataloged. I wrote down every detail I could remember about Helen: the way she smiled when Mark left the room, the stories she told about family sacrifices, the way she had once joked about how a bit of discipline keeps love in place. There was an arc to her voice that had always sat uneasily with the softness she showed in public. Patterns reveal themselves if you watch long enough. And then, in a small, unremarkable drawer, another pattern stirred awake. A neighbor, Albert Harrison, a cousin, a man who kept to himself, knocked one afternoon with a brown envelope. He slid it into my hands like contraband, eyes darting like a boy who had stolen cookies. He said, without preface, "I think you should see this." Inside were recordings, old, dated, of conversations that, on first listen, carried a tone of smug planning. They suggested coordination and a willingness to manipulate narratives to protect reputation. I put the recorder on the counter with the care of someone handling evidence. I tell you about Albert because power, like weather, has cracks. People in its shadow sometimes want air. Whether his motives were guilt or a desire for distance from an ugly family lore, I could not know. But his envelope shifted something in the case away from a single assault and toward a pattern. That envelope would come to matter in ways I could not then anticipate. For the moment, it was a thin thread, an invitation to look deeper. We played the recordings once, twice, and then in the presence of a trusted prosecutor. The tone of the conversations was unmistakable. Names were used as tools. Events were reframed as mistakes to be smoothed. The words painted a history where reputation mattered more than a person's safety. In that room, the legal team leaned forward, the way people do when something that was anecdotal becomes potentially demonstrable. This was the point at which our private family crisis began to touch institutional textures. The small domestic violence incident had shifted into a case with ripples, tangents that might touch cold cases, that might reveal patterns that stretched back further than our dinner table. The possibility of more than one victim, the suggestion of cover-up, the taste of systemic protection, all of it folded into the legal canvas. I remember thinking at that moment that the work I had done for so many clients had prepared me for this by teaching me patience and the discipline of documentation. But I also felt the particular vulnerability of mothers who enter a public fight on behalf of their child. Exposure is inevitable, and the world often judges the mother first. The protective instinct collides with the reality that truth needs witnesses, and witnesses can be invited or intimidated. We filed the additional materials with the prosecutor's office under careful advisement. We flagged certain conversations for forensic review. We prepared statements. We arranged for Ariana to give a detailed account in the presence of a victim advocate. Everyone moved with the kind of methodical urgency that feels both exhaustive and insufficient. When the district attorney convened a meeting to discuss next steps, I sat there with a file of notes and a cup of coffee gone cold. Around the table, people spoke in procedural cadences: what could be proven, what risks existed, the chain of custody for evidence. The lawyer in me wanted to argue every point. The mother in me wanted to insist on speed. They are different energies. We balance them. The DA said plainly that cases like this can be messy. He explained, in the cautious language of prosecutors, how influence and money could reshape narratives and how difficult it can be to bring charges when families rally. He stressed the importance of evidence and corroboration. He also said, with a rare bluntness, that when someone applauds an act of violence, it often reveals more than a single failing. That sentence lodged in my mind. We walked out of that meeting with a sense of purpose we had not had in the first few days, energy that was not only defensive but investigatory. We would not be content with a limited frame of domestic incident. We would ask whether pattern and privilege had been used to hide more. There were dangers in that approach. The stakes were higher, but so was the potential for real accountability. That evening, as I drove Ariana back to the apartment she would soon leave for a safer place, she reached across and took my hand. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was fragile in a way that made gratitude feel like courage. "I couldn't have done this without you." I thought of Robert and the small certainties he taught us, principle in the face of convenience, and the idea that family is sanctity, not a shield for harm. I felt in that instant the merging of my life as lawyer and mother into one stubborn, necessary action to do the honest work of holding truth to light, even if the work cost us comfort. We were far from the end. Arrest had been made, protections granted, evidence collected, but I knew, as I have known in cases that took years, that the most difficult parts were still ahead. Smear campaigns, countersuits, the slow attrition of public opinion. I also knew that sometimes the most decisive moments in a case are not the dramatic ones. They are the quiet, persistent acts of documentation, witness cultivation, and refusal to be silenced. So we prepared. We cataloged the recordings. We scheduled medical evaluations and spoke to therapists. We kept a small ritual for Robert to remind ourselves of what family ought to mean. And we watched with a kind of brittle determination as the first threads of counter-narrative began to creep into our periphery. The applause at the table had been the moment that made action unavoidable. The single phone call I made that night had initiated a chain. What I could not yet see was how far some people would go to preserve the narrative they preferred. I knew only that we had crossed a threshold, one that would demand everything we had of courage, patience, and truth-telling. When you are in the middle of it, the future is a series of tasks: make a record, secure a witness, check a box. But in the quiet that followed, I also felt something else, an ember of conviction that had nothing to do with paperwork. It was the moral certainty that a mother keeps when she sees her child's dignity harmed and refuses to let that dignity be rewritten by someone else's applause. We had made the first call. The law had answered with cuffs and a paper order. The night had given us safety in the narrow sense. The work of actual justice, of undoing a structure that had enabled that applause, was only beginning. If this story is touching something you carry, please type the name of your city below or share this with someone who needs to hear it. It helps us know we are not alone. The weeks after the arrest felt like walking through a town where every window turned to watch you. At first, the scrutiny was clinical. Police reports, interviews, witness statements, but soon it took on a social life of its own. Mark's family had resources, and as I had feared, they were not above using them. What began as background murmurs metastasized into a campaign designed to make our truth feel like rumor. It started small, a paid blog post that implied Ariana was emotionally unstable, an op-ed piece in a neighborhood paper that framed our family as split by complicated domestic matters. Someone leaked selective details to colleagues at Ariana's plant under the pretense of concern. A PR firm, one of the kind that keeps reputations shiny, was quietly hired to shape a counter-narrative. They planted photos of Mark at charity events, resurfaced testimonials about his kindness, and emphasized family values in every place they could buy attention. They were not content with narrative control alone. The pressure bled into institutions. A thin, anonymous complaint accusing me of professional impropriety arrived at the state bar. Its language was technical enough to sound credible, and vague enough that a disciplinary inquiry could be prolonged indefinitely. Around the same time, there was a letter from an accountant I had never met, flagged by HR at my small practice, an audit notice that used the bureaucratic voice of the IRS to suggest errors on past filings. It was the kind of sting that pauses a career. Investigations are slow and invasive, and they bleed confidence from the people they touch. The strategy was clear. If you can make the victim and the person defending her look messy, ethical gray, financially careless, unstable, then the story loses its center. The applause at my table would dissolve into a memory, and the narrative would be about our imperfections, not their violence. I have seen this maneuver before in cases where money and social capital were abundant. I did not expect it to hurt like a physical blow. There were other strikes. Anonymous social posts that named our street, insinuations about Ariana's reliability, a doctored photograph circulated to make it appear she had been intoxicated at a work event. Friends distanced themselves in the ways people do when they calculate risk. Fewer invitations, delayed calls, conversation avoided. Some colleagues at the law firm where I had once been a name on a door sent notes of concern that felt performative rather than supportive. People meant well, but fear is contagious, and some of it was the same fear that people with influence wield to silence. These were attrition tactics. They were not loud in the way an arrest is loud. They were slow and corrosive. A bar complaint threatens professional livelihood. An audit robs you of the energy to fight. A smear campaign makes prospective witnesses think twice about testifying. If you have to weather them all at once, you can be worn thin. I kept a steadying schedule. At dawn, I reviewed files. At noon, I checked in with Ariana. And at night, I let myself be the mother who made soup and stacked clean plates on the drying rack. My legal training told me to respond in a measured way. Preserve records, document every contact, forward threatening messages to counsel, and keep a list of witnesses. My maternal instinct reminded me to sit in the small moments where healing could still take hold. I moved between those roles like someone changing lenses until both were clear. We responded in the only honest way we could: transparency and documentation. We compiled a chronology of the smear items, screenshots, URLs, receipts for paid posts, emails to HR. We reported things to cybercrime units when it became clear that false materials were being manufactured. We lodged counters at social platforms to remove doctored images. When the audit notice arrived, I referred it to our accountant and let the process unfold under professional advice. I refused to be baited into responding emotionally to procedural attacks. All of that took energy, so did the personal toll. Ariana's sleep became fragile. She no longer trusted that a friendly voice on the phone was unconnected to someone looking to triangulate information for a narrative attack. People who had been her friends sent lukewarm messages that fluttered like fall leaves, brief, uncertain, distancing. It felt like mourning the presence of a public world that had been kinder in the past. And then, out of one of those small contradictions, where power has cracks and people who know something feel compelled to pass it on, an envelope arrived. It came the way dangerous things often do, anonymously, in plain packaging, unremarkable except for the contents. Inside were files, transcripts, and audio. The recordings were not the casual scraps you expect when two people gossip. They were old ownership conversations captured in voices that arranged events into strategies. There were forensic notes attached, handwritten observations by someone who had already begun to think like an investigator, timestamps, mentions of bank records, annotations about who had been present when certain stories were polished. I remember how my hands shook when I opened it. There was no return address. The package had no overt accusation, only evidence that suggested a pattern, manipulation, narrative construction, and most alarmingly, a reference to a death that I had never before connected to their family. The document suggested that Helen's late husband, someone the family had always described as a natural death, had been discussed in ways the public did not see. The recordings included a conversation in which Helen, in a voice that carried the kind of casual cruelty I had witnessed at the table, spoke about problems that must be contained and referenced the vocabulary of final solutions in a tone that chilled me. I sat with the envelope at my kitchen table, the place that had once been sanctuary, and thought of how many times a family story had been edited to leave out the sharp parts. The contents of that package advanced us into terrain I had not anticipated. There was now the possibility, no, the likelihood, that there was a history of concealment here and that our dinner was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern where the family had weaponized its resources to keep things quiet. We handed the materials to a trusted prosecutor and requested forensic review. The first listening was slow and clinical, the same way you would examine a fragile document for fingerprints, carefully, reverently, with an eye to provenance. An audio analyst checked metadata, timestamps, and background noise. A records specialist compared handwriting with other documents. The team began to construct a chain of evidence. At last, the anonymous hint became something with texture, corroborating details, names that matched bank ledgers, references that could be checked against old newspaper archives and public records. At that point, Albert Harrison, the cousin who had first come to me with his envelope, stepped forward publicly. Whether his conscience had finally outweighed his fear, or whether the anonymity of the first drop had made it safe, I cannot know. What I do know is that Albert's testimony shifted the case in an unexpected way. He became the human connector between our kitchen and a pattern of behavior documented in brown envelopes and buried audio files. Albert told us stories in the quiet manner of someone who had watched dysfunction from the edges for decades. He remembered things, a hastily arranged settlement, a quiet phone call to a hospital that had happened the night Helen's husband died, a gratitude note that read strangely like payment. He did not appear to be a heroic figure in the cinematic sense. He was instead an ordinary man who reached a moment of moral clarity. His willingness to come forward forced the system to enlarge its focus. Within weeks, the district attorney's office reopened a file from a decade earlier, the death of a man who had been treated publicly as the victim of a tragic but unremarkable illness. The DA's team treated the matter with professional caution. They did not leak details. They examined coroner's files, hospital records, and police reports that had once cornered the death into a tidy box. They compared them against the files from the anonymous package. The word reinvestigation does not capture the labor of it. It was methodical, forensic work, retracing a path that had previously been smoothed. When a cold case reopens, the world watches with a different attention. The PR team that had been spinning on behalf of Mark scrambled to contain the narrative. The smear campaign lost some of its teeth. It is difficult to smear when new, harder questions are being asked in prosecutorial offices. Still, influence is resilient. There were counter-arguments ready, claims of misinterpretation, of malicious manipulation of audio metadata, and hints that witnesses like Albert were unreliable. The music changed pace, but the instruments remained the same: reputation, insinuation, and illegal maneuvering. Then came the deposition calendars, the subpoenas, and the careful orchestration of trials. The case against Mark moved toward indictment on charges that referenced the assault and related criminal conduct. The files pertaining to Helen's involvement in prior events were compiled into a separate investigative folder that suggested possible obstruction and, eventually, charges connected to that earlier death. I will not rehearse legal technicalities here. The public record shows the outcomes. Prosecutors charged both with offenses that reflected the weight of the evidence that had mounted. At trial, I learned how naked truth becomes when you strip legal theater away. It is the slow, steady accumulation of small things. Witnesses like neighbors who had heard raised voices, a rear surface security camera that captured a late-night car movement, a payroll ledger showing odd transfers. Each item on its own might have been ignored, but together they formed a lattice that blinded the defenses. We called experts in forensic audio to explain how recordings could not have been easily fabricated. We brought on investigators who traced unaccounted-for payments. Most importantly, we listened to the women who were brave enough to testify, Ariana among them. Ariana's testimony was the hardest and the clearest moment of the trials. She rose in the witness box and spoke with a voice that was steady despite the ache within it. She explained not only the night of the slap, but the pattern of small degradations that had preceded it. She spoke about the texture of control, the way apologies arrived like fog, how isolation looked like protection, and how shame feels like responsibility for someone else's aggression. She did not wallow in drama. She narrated. The jury listened in silence the way a room listens to a factual recounting of events that demand moral clarity. Outside the courtroom, Helen's supporters tried a variety of tactics. They filed motions that probed the edges of evidence. They lobbied quietly. They hired those painstakingly polite defense lawyers who could take a small uncertainty and magnify it into doubt. We expected that. Law is a contest of narratives as much as it is a discourse of proof. That said, in this case, the evidence had a coherence that was difficult to undo. The audio files, the documents, Albert's testimony, and the metadata analysis formed a lattice, one strand reinforcing another. When the jury returned a guilty verdict against Mark, it felt in the chamber like an allowance for truth to be heard. He was convicted on multiple counts related to the assault and behaviors that reflected the larger pattern of control. The sentence that followed, decided after a separate proceeding, was the legal consequence the system was able to deliver for those crimes. I do not recount the numbers here because what mattered to us was not the arithmetic of punishment. It was the formal acknowledgement that a crime had occurred and that responsibility had been assigned. Helen's trial was quieter in one sense and louder in another. It was quieter because the community had already absorbed much of our narrative. It was louder because the stakes were existential for a matriarch who had long cultivated a public persona. The evidence suggested that her role had not been that of a distant observer, but of an architect, someone who had a hand in managing narratives, in orchestrating the mise-en-scène of reputation, and in directing resources where necessary to contain problems. Her indictment included charges related to a prior death, charges that assumed the role of obstruction and suggested intentional concealment. In the witness box, the prosecution presented the pattern: conversations wherein the family talked about containing things, payments that appeared to smooth over inconvenient medical records, and a string of statements that could be read, when connected, to show an intent to keep certain facts from the light. The defense argued for plausible explanations, for coincidence, for the unreliability of memory. The jury listened to the tapes. They heard the applause at our table in a broader context. When they returned with a guilty verdict on counts related to obstruction and to the earlier death, it felt like the legal system, imperfect and slow, had finally recognized a pattern it had once missed. I will not say the trials were cathartic. They were hard. They extracted things from our bodies that never fully returned. But the verdicts did something that mattered. They dissolved a protective narrative that had been allowed to obscure harm. They also affirmed something else: the corroding power of documentation. The envelope, the anonymous package, the recordings, they mattered because they resisted being rewritten. In the end, evidence exposed the architecture of the defense. The applause at our table had not been an isolated incident, but part of a system that sometimes privileges preservation of image over the protection of life. Reality after conviction is never simple. There were appeals. There were members of the community who continued to support Helen and Mark. There were, as always, legal complexities. But the decisions in court provided a foundation from which rebuilding could begin. For Ariana, it meant something tangible, safety that was recognized by the law. For me, it meant a professional vindication that carried personal weight. The bar complaint that had hovered like a storm cloud was dismissed as without merit. The audit concluded with no punitive findings. Small administrative stones that had been thrown in an attempt to destabilize us had been returned to sender. That does not mean the scars evaporated. It means we could begin constructing new rhythms. The healing was incremental. Ariana moved into a small apartment a few blocks away that she painted herself, a camel beige that made the morning light warm. She went back to work in a different capacity for the same company, accepted reluctantly at first and then with a growing steadiness. Her laughter returned in halting pieces. She began to date slowly, with someone who had no public life of influence and who made space for the ordinary, a partner who cooked pancakes and asked about her day without judgment. It was, to both of us, a great mercy. There were other quiet victories I cherish. The women who had once sent tentative messages grew bolder. One by one, a handful of survivors in the area reached out to say our story helped them name what had happened to them and to take a step toward protection. A support group that met in a church basement, the kind of patchwork network that saves people in 1,000 ways, began to get more attendees. A few prosecutors contacted me in private to say that the evidence we brought and the way we organized it had helped them reconsider cold files in other counties. Those ripples moved outward in modest but real ways. I had to reconcile the professional with the personal. My practice did not explode in triumph. It reoriented. Clients arrived who wanted someone who had both legal skill and a willingness to enter messy human fights. My license stayed intact, not simply because I defended my ethics, but because the record showed my work had been guided by a commitment to truth and to my clients' welfare. The bar complaint was an attempt to muddy waters. The dismissal felt like a small clearing. Visits to Mark in custody were brief and calm. I went because I wanted to see the man who had once been part of our lives up close and to observe what justice looks like from the inside. His posture was a quiet admission of the collapse of the facade that had sustained him. Ariana watched me go and come with a complicated expression, relief, sorrow, and something like the odd grace of closure. We did not gloat, we did not revel. We acknowledged that a human being had been punished, and that meant loss somewhere. Justice for us was about accountability, not vengeance. A garden became the place where our household reassembled its dignity. There is a patch of rosemary and lemon thyme that Robert planted the year we moved in. One spring, Ariana and I planted a small row of lavender along the fence. We would sit there and talk about anything other than trials. The roast was no longer the ritual that defined our Sundays, but sometimes we made it and placed a small slice at the head of the table in a quiet homage to Robert. That practice reminded us that memory does not have to be a museum of loss. It can be an altar to life lived. The applause at the table never left me entirely. Some nights it returned like a dream I could not shake. The slap, the slow clapping, the way silence stretched. But its meaning had shifted. That gesture, once an instrument of power, had been exposed as part of a structure that could be dismantled. For all its imperfections, our legal system had tools, arrests, forensic analysis, testimony, that, when wielded with persistence, could compel truth into the open. I think of the cost often. There was no way to neutralize the pain of seeing your daughter hurt, nor could I fully restore the lost months of trust that abuse steals. The war of attrition had been brutal in the ways that matter most. It strained relationships, consumed energy, and left tender places that required care. But the verdicts, the documents, the willingness of people like Albert to speak, these were decisive. They were the proof that persistent truth-telling can peel back a narrative built to conceal. There is a moral in that phrasing, but it is not a tidy moral. The lesson is not that the law is unassailable or that power cannot still tilt outcomes. It is instead that documentation and courage can create openings. The one call I made that night was not a magic formula. It was a concrete action that created a trace. That trace, combined with later, careful accumulation of evidence, produced consequences. We were persistent and methodical. We were also vulnerable, and we paid for that vulnerability in ways a family does when it refuses to be silent. A few months after the trials, I stood in our garden and invited Ariana to sit with me. We ate lunch, and she told me about a lab experiment she had overseen where a small catalyst changed the outcome of a reaction in a way that had surprised everyone. Her voice warmed with the pleasure of a scientist delighted by an unexpected result. I thought of the word catalyst then in a new way. Small actions that change the trajectory of much larger processes. We began to say the things aloud that no one had said before. We spoke about boundaries as a skill, not a moral failing. We spoke about power as a structure that must be testified against, not placated. We wrote letters to the survivors we had met in court, to the victim advocates who had sat with us in coffee shops, and to people who had supported us with casseroles and text messages. Those letters were slow, careful thank you notes, tiny, luminous things that add up. In the months after, we also tried to be measured about what we made public. The story belongs to others. Each witness owns their testimony. We released only what had to be released and worked with professionals to ensure survivors' privacy was protected. We learned to distinguish between the relief of being believed and the urge to make a spectacle of hurt. There is dignity in restraint. I will not suggest that everyone who calls for help will have the same arc we did. Influence, timing, and evidence play enormous roles in how a case unfolds. What I will say is this: the architecture of power can be undermined by documentation, allies with courage, and the willingness of witnesses to speak. Sometimes an anonymous package arrives. Sometimes a cousin opens his mouth. Sometimes a prosecutor listens. Sometimes a jury returns a verdict. These are not certainties. They are contingencies that require acts of courage from people who might otherwise remain silent. The price of speaking out. The story belongs to others. Each witness owns their testimony. We released only what had to be released and worked with professionals to ensure survivors' privacy was protected. We learned to distinguish between the relief of being believed and the urge to make a spectacle of hurt. There is dignity in restraint. I will not suggest that everyone who calls for help will have the same arc we did. Influence, timing, and evidence play enormous roles in how a case unfolds. What I will say is this: the architecture of power can be undermined by documentation, allies with courage, and the willingness of witnesses to speak. Sometimes an anonymous package arrives. Sometimes a cousin opens his mouth. Sometimes a prosecutor listens. Sometimes a jury returns a verdict. These are not certainties. They are contingencies that require acts of courage from people who might otherwise remain silent. The price of speaking out is not small. It is paid in sleepless nights, in the erosion of social niceties, and sometimes in the threat of professional repercussion. But there is another price if you do not speak: the perpetuation of harm, the quiet allowance of a story that is kinder to the perpetrators than to the wounded. That moral calculus is personal and terrible to carry, but it is real. We rebuilt in ways that felt tender and ordinary. Ariana returned to her work with more confidence. She began mentoring younger women in her profession who were navigating difficult relationships and professional pressures. I returned to my practice with a deeper sense of mission, a determination to support survivors with the humility that comes from having been a mother in the midst of a case. We both learned the value of small routines: a Sunday walk, a clear inbox, a weekly call with a friend who will tell you the truth. One afternoon, when the lavender was in bloom and the lemon thyme perfumed the air, a woman knocked on my gate. She had come because she had seen our story online and wanted to say thank you. She told me that our refusal to be silent had given her courage to seek safety. She said that she had been afraid to call the police because she believed that wealth would drown out her voice, and that seeing our case move the way it did made her feel possible. Her words landed like rain on parched ground. If there is one thing I want you to remember from this story, it is not the details of the courtroom or the ledger entries. It is the humanness. A mother who refused to accept the rewriting of her daughter's dignity, a daughter who testified to the truth of her experience, and a network of people, prosecutors, analysts, a cousin with a conscience, who turned small acts into a cumulative force. It is the fact that a single phone call placed into the record can be one of the first stones of a longer arc that leads to accountability. We sit now in the quiet aftermath that is not the end, but a new beginning. Ariana has plans she is excited about: a fellowship that will let her study industrial safety protocols, and a small group of friends who bring soup when days are heavy. I think of Robert, and I place a small slice of roast on the empty head of the table now and again, not as a ritual of loss, but as an echo of the kind of integrity he expected of us. His memory remains a compass. The applause that made my blood run cold the night of the slap became, in a strange way, an enunciation. It revealed not just a cruelty in one household, but an entire mechanism that can be used to silence. Exposing that mechanism required patience and legal rigor. It required courage and the willingness of others to step forward. It required that we keep the record clear and the voices honest. If you are watching this and you are carrying something similar, please know that there are resources listed in the description below, hotlines and support organizations that can help. If this video matters to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and consider subscribing for more survivor stories. Stories have a way of moving people. They can ripple into action in ways we cannot predict. I have told you what happened at our table and what came after: the slap, Helen's slow applause, the decision that became the one call. the subsequent fight through legal and social terrain, the anonymous package that turned up hidden conversations, the reopening of an old file, the trials and the verdicts that followed. Above all, I have told you about how truth, once accumulated and presented, can break open narratives built to protect the powerful. The one call changed everything, not because a phone has mystical power, but because it placed a fact into a world that could and would be recorded. That record, combined with stubborn, careful work, gave us a line to pull. It required sacrifice, strategy, and a stubborn refusal to accept the rewrite. In the end, accountability was not a spectacle. It was documentation, courage, and the slow work of refusing silence. Thank you for listening. If this story has reached you, please share it and subscribe for more survivor testimonies. If you or someone you know needs immediate help, the resources below can guide you to support. We are not alone in this work. Sometimes the difference between anonymity and justice is the willingness of someone else to step forward and say, "I saw this."